We open not on a battlefield or a throne room, but on a modest kitchen. An elderly Chinese cook, her hands worn and wise, methodically grinds coarse gray crystals into a bubbling pot. Her family eats, satisfied by the flavor. The camera pushes in on the salt, the granules glowing like tiny diamonds. Now we smash cut, a majestic imperial palace. Emperors in silk robes preside over mountains of tax ledgers, not gold or grain, but columns meticulously detailing salt. How did a substance so simple, so universally necessary for life, become the ultimate instrument of imperial power? This is the central contradiction. The most humble kitchen staple was, for centuries, the bedrock of the world's most sophisticated economic machine. It fed the people, yet it enslaved them to the state. It preserved life, and it financed empires. This is the story of the great salt monopoly. The story begins not with a decree, but with a geographical reality. Visualize the vast map of ancient China, from the fertile river basins of the Yellow River to the rugged southern highlands. Food, especially grains and vegetables, was the engine of civilization, but it was perishable. Salt was the only known preservative that could stave off starvation through brutal winters and long campaigns. Without it, armies couldn't march, cities couldn't store surplus, and trade over distance was a fantasy. The Chinese state, in its embryonic form during the Zhou Dynasty, recognized this fundamental truth early. Control of salt sources, the coastal salt marshes of the Shandong Peninsula and the inland salt lakes of the arid north, was not merely a commercial advantage. It was a strategic imperative rivaling control of water or iron. The state's survival was intrinsically linked to its ability to guarantee this white crystal's flow. However, the first attempts at control were clumsy, more about brute force seizure than economic engineering. Local warlords and feudal lords taxed salt caravans, creating a patchwork of tariffs that stifled trade and bred corruption. The cost was ultimately borne by the peasant, who saw the price of this essential good fluctuate wildly with the whims of local power. This chaotic system created scarcity amidst plenty, as salt produced in one region struggled to reach another. The economic inefficiency was staggering. It was within this climate of waste and instability that a revolutionary thinker emerged, one who would see not just a commodity to be taxed, but a system to be built. The stage was set for a fiscal philosopher who would weaponize economics. Enter Guan Zhong, chief minister to Duke Huan of the state of Qi in the 7th century BC. Often called the world's first political economist, Guan Zhong observed the chaos and saw a breathtaking opportunity. His genius was to understand the concept of inelastic demand. The people must have salt. Their need for it would not diminish if the price rose moderately. Therefore, he argued, the state should not just tax salt. It should monopolize its entire production and distribution. In his seminal work, the Guanzi, he laid out the blueprint. The state would control the key salt-producing regions, license all production, set fixed prices, and criminalize private trade. The profit margin, he calculated, would be a tax that the people paid willingly every day, without realizing it, simply by eating. The Qi state implemented his plan. Officials were dispatched to manage salt pans. Government warehouses rose near production sites. Licensed merchants, acting as state agents, were given exclusive rights to transport and sell salt within designated zones. The result was a fiscal revolution. State revenues from the salt monopoly soon dwarfed all other forms of taxation. Duke Huan's treasury swelled, financing a powerful army and ambitious public works without raising the explicit land tax that traditionally sparked peasant revolts. The monopoly was a silent, pervasive extraction machine. Yet as Qi grew powerful, the very success of this system created a dangerous template. A blueprint for control so effective it would soon attract the gaze of a much larger, more ambitious power seeking to unify all under heaven, the Qin state. The Warring States period was a cauldron of violence and innovation, where survival depended on administrative and military efficiency. The Qin state, viewed by its rivals as a barbarous Western kingdom, embraced this ruthlessness in all things, especially economics. As they conquered territories, they didn't just annex land, they ingested systems. The salt monopoly of Qi was not copied. It was perfected and hardened into a tool of total war. Under the legalist philosophy of Shangyang and later Li Si, every aspect of life, was to serve the state. Salt was no longer just a revenue stream. It became a ligament in the body politic, a means to enforce standardization, suppress dissent, and fund the endless engine of conquest. The Qin system was characterized by terrifying bureaucracy. Every step of the salt chain was documented on bamboo slips, with triplicate copies. Production quotas were assigned to state-owned salt pans, manned by conscripted laborers and convicts. The yield of each evaporative pond was recorded. The salt was then transported in standardized carts, along state-maintained direct roads, to official distribution depots. At each transfer, seals were checked, weights were verified by state inspectors, and ledgers were updated. The private possession of untaxed salt became a capital offense. This created a dual economy: the official, documented flow of white salt, and a burgeoning black market where the penalty for a pound of smuggled crystals was death. The revenue generated was astronomical and directed with singular purpose: warfare. Salt profits paid for the bronze of weapons, the grain for armies, and the engineering of roads that moved those armies faster than any rival. It was the economic fuel for the mass-produced terracotta army and the relentless campaigns that, one by one, consumed the other states. When Qin Shi Huang finally declared himself the first emperor in 221 BC, unifying China, the salt monopoly was not relaxed as a wartime measure. It was institutionalized as a permanent pillar of the imperial state. The monopoly had proven it could bankroll the unification of a civilization. Now, it would be tasked with holding that civilization together. Yet, the Qin's brutal efficiency contained the seeds of its own destruction. The very rigidity of the system made it brittle. The costs of endless expansion, the Great Wall, the Apang Palace, the imperial tombs, drove production quotas to inhuman levels. Salt workers, treated as disposable state assets, died in the harsh marshes. The fixed official price of salt crept upward, squeezing peasants already devastated by corvée labor. The monopoly, designed to extract wealth silently, became a visible symbol of oppression. When rebellions erupted following the first emperor's death, they were not just political revolts, but economic ones. Smugglers and desperate peasants targeted salt depots and government offices, seeking not just freedom from Qin law, but access to the life-preserving crystal the state had locked away. The Qin dynasty collapsed in fire and chaos, but its most powerful fiscal invention, the total state monopoly, would be inherited and reluctantly refined by its successor. The Han dynasty emerged from the ashes of the Qin, acutely aware that pure terror was an unsustainable governance model. The early Han emperors, notably Emperor Wen and Emperor Jing, adopted a laissez-faire policy known as Wu Wei, or non-interference. They disbanded many of the harshest Qin laws, including relaxing the state's grip on salt and iron. Private merchants were allowed to prosper, and for a time, salt became a vibrant, competitive trade. This economic liberalization fueled a golden age of commerce and cultural flourishing, the profits of trade spreading wealth beyond the imperial treasury. However, this prosperity created a new, unforeseen threat: the rise of merchant princes whose power and private armies began to rival the state itself. The crisis point arrived under the ambitious Emperor Wu, a ruler bent on massive territorial expansion against the nomadic Xiongnu Confederation. The wars were catastrophically expensive. The state treasury, reliant on land taxes from a war-ravaged peasantry, emptied. Meanwhile, the salt and iron merchants, who had grown fabulously wealthy during the liberal years, hoarded their capital, refusing to loan to the desperate state. Emperor Wu faced a stark choice: bankrupt the empire or reclaim the economic heights. In 119 BC, he turned to his financial mastermind, Sang Hongyang. Sang Hongyang, a merchant's son who understood commerce from the inside, designed a monopoly system more sophisticated than the Qin's brute force model. He reinstated the state monopoly on salt and iron, but with a critical innovation: public-private partnership. The state would retain ultimate ownership and control of the key production sites, the mountains and seas that yielded salt and ore. However, instead of using conscripted labor, the state would license production to experienced private entrepreneurs. These merchants would provide the capital, tools, and expertise to run the operations. In return, they had to purchase expensive official licenses, use state-provided equipment at a cost, and sell their entire output to the state at a fixed, low price. The state then became the sole wholesaler, selling the salt at a much higher price to distributors across the empire. The profit margin was the state's tax. This system was diabolically effective. It harnessed the efficiency and innovation of private enterprise while capturing all the surplus value for the imperial coffers. It also neutered the merchant class by making them dependent on state licenses, a form of controlled prosperity. The revenue flooded back in, financing Emperor Wu's wars and solidifying Han power. Yet, this great debate over state control versus private enterprise sparked one of history's first recorded economic policy disputes, a philosophical clash that would echo for millennia. The monopoly was now not just a tool, but a subject of imperial ideology. For every action of the state, there is an equal and opposite reaction in the shadows. The Han monopoly, while brilliant in theory, created a massive price differential between the state's cost and its selling price. This differential was the margin of rebellion. It birthed a professional class of outlaws, salt smugglers. These were not petty criminals, but sophisticated entrepreneurs operating vast, illicit networks. They bribed low-paid government inspectors, forged transportation permits, and organized nighttime transports along remote riverways and mountain paths. They developed techniques to recrystallize smuggled salt to mimic the official grain, and created hidden compartments in carts and boats. The state responded with escalating force, turning the economic conflict into a low-grade war. The boundaries of salt distribution zones became militarized frontiers. Checkpoints staffed by armed guards dotted major roads and rivers. The penalties grew more severe, from fines to flogging, exile, and eventually execution for large-scale smuggling. This created a perverse cycle. Harsher enforcement raised the risks, which in turn raised the black market price of smuggled salt, making the trade even more lucrative for those willing to defy the state. Some smuggling operations grew so powerful they evolved into private armies, controlling entire regions and challenging local magistrates. The most significant consequence was the corrosion of state authority and morality. The system corrupted its own enforcers. A government salt inspector's salary was meager, but the bribes offered by smugglers could make him wealthy. Many officials became complicit, turning a blind eye for a cut of the profit or even investing in smuggling rings themselves. This created a gray zone where the line between lawman and outlaw blurred. The people, caught in the middle, often sympathized with the smugglers, who provided an essential good at a cheaper price than the grasping state. The smuggler became a folk hero, a Robin Hood figure resisting an oppressive tax. This eternal cat-and-mouse game had a profound economic impact. The state was forced to spend a significant portion of its salt revenue just on enforcement, maintaining the salt police, building guard towers, and prosecuting offenders. This was deadweight loss, wealth consumed in the act of controlling wealth. Furthermore, the existence of a thriving black market was a constant drain on potential revenue, a leak in the imperial treasury. The state's attempt to create a perfect, closed system was forever undermined by human ingenuity and the basic laws of supply and demand. The monopoly was never fully airtight. It was a contested space, a silent economic civil war that raged for centuries beneath the surface of imperial glory. Following the Han collapse and centuries of fragmentation, the Tang Dynasty reunified China and faced the same eternal problem: how to feed the state. They inherited the salt monopoly concept but sought to tame its chaos with superior bureaucracy. The Tang innovation was the creation of a dedicated, professional administrative body, the Salt and Iron Commission. This was no longer a side duty for tax collectors. It was a powerful, centralized ministry with its own hierarchy, regional commissioners, and a vast clerical army. The commission's first task was to implement the salt certificate system, a revolutionary financial instrument. Here's how it worked. The state maintained control of production at key sites like the salt lakes of Hudong. Merchants who wished to obtain salt for trade no longer bought the physical commodity at a depot. Instead, they had to first deliver a quota of grain to the imperial army stationed on the distant northern frontier, a region always short of supplies. In return for this grain, the merchant received a government-issued salt certificate, a piece of officially stamped paper that entitled the bearer to collect a specific quantity of salt from a designated state warehouse back in the heartland. This system was a masterstroke of logistical and financial engineering. It solved multiple problems at once. First, it efficiently supplied remote frontier armies without the state having to organize and pay for long, vulnerable grain supply caravans. The merchants bore the cost and risk of transport. Second, it strictly controlled the salt supply, as only certificates generated salt. Third, and most ingeniously, these salt certificates soon took on a life of their own. They became a form of negotiable, paper-based currency. Merchants could trade them, use them as collateral for loans, or sell them to other merchants. A vibrant secondary market for certificates sprang up in cities like Chang'an and Luoyang. The Song Dynasty, which followed the Tang, pushed this financialization even further. Facing constant military pressure and needing vast revenues, the Song government began to overissue salt certificates, promising more salt than the state-controlled pans could physically produce. This created a speculative bubble. Certificates traded at wildly inflated prices based on future promises, not present reality. When the state couldn't honor them, the value would crash, ruining merchants and causing financial panics. The salt certificate, born as a tool of military logistics, had evolved into a primitive state bond and a speculative security. The monopoly was no longer just about controlling a commodity. It was about manipulating an entire financial ecosystem, with all the power and peril that entailed. The Mongol conquest under Kublai Khan and the establishment of the Yuan dynasty represented a profound shock to the Chinese system. The Mongols were pragmatic nomads, less interested in Confucian bureaucratic perfection than in revenue extraction and global trade. They viewed the salt monopoly not as a philosophical tool of statecraft, but as a simple cash cow to be milked with maximum efficiency. They retained the basic Tangsong certificate system but stripped away many of its complex refinements, focusing on output and tax yield. Importantly, they integrated China's salt economy into the vast Pax Mongolica trade network. Under the Mongols, salt became a truly globalized commodity. Chinese salt, particularly the high-quality product from the coastal regions, was now exported along the Silk Road west to Central Asia, Persia, and beyond. It was traded for horses, gems, and silver. Salt from other parts of the empire, like Tibet, flowed into China. The Mongol administration, skilled in managing long-distance commerce, imposed transit taxes and used salt as a tool of diplomatic exchange, gifting it to vassal kingdoms. The monopoly's revenue was funneled not just into the Forbidden City, but into financing the Khan's extravagant court and his failed attempts to invade Japan and Java. This period also saw an intensification of a dark corollary to the salt trade: human trafficking. The state salt pans and mines had always used forced labor, but the Mongols expanded this on an industrial scale. Prisoners of war, convicted criminals, and dispossessed peasants were conscripted in droves to work the evaporation ponds and mines under brutal conditions. Mortality rates were horrific. This salt slavery created a grim paradox. The substance that preserved life for millions was produced at the cost of thousands of lives in hellish labor camps. The human cost of the monopoly was never higher, hidden behind the glittering trade figures. The Yuan dynasty's legacy for the salt monopoly was one of brutal simplification and globalization. They proved the system could be run by outsiders purely for profit, divorcing it from its traditional ideological justifications about supporting the state and stabilizing society. They also demonstrated its vulnerability to corruption on a grand scale, as Mongol princes and their merchant allies siphoned off profits. When the Yuan fell to the native Ming rebellion in 1368, the new rulers faced a daunting task. They had to reclaim this corrupted, brutalized, yet indispensable economic engine and somehow restore it to serve a Chinese vision of order, a task that would require another radical reinvention. The Ming dynasty sought to expel the barbarian influence and restore an idealized Chinese order. For the salt monopoly, this meant a return to hyper-bureaucracy, but on an unprecedented scale. They perfected the salt certificate system, organizing the entire empire into a handful of massive, centralized salt distribution zones, the most famous being the Lianghuai district around the Huai River. The bureaucracy became an end in itself. A merchant needed to navigate a labyrinth of offices, seals, and approvals that could take years, all to obtain the right to buy certificates to then obtain salt. This overengineering created a rigid, top-heavy system that stifled innovation and efficiency. Production methods at state-designated salt pans remained archaic. The focus was not on improving yield or quality, but on maintaining the complex paperwork that justified the existence of thousands of bureaucrats. The cost of maintaining this immense administrative superstructure began to eat into the profits it generated. Furthermore, the system became a patronage machine. Lucrative salt merchant licenses were granted as political favors to imperial relatives, powerful eunuchs, and loyal military officers, creating a class of hereditary salt magnates who grew fantastically wealthy without ever touching a salt crystal. These salt merchant families, particularly in cities like Yangzhou, became the Rockefellers and Rothschilds of Ming China. They built lavish gardens, patronized the arts, and financed scholars. Their wealth, however, was parasitic. It was derived not from productive enterprise or trade innovation, but from their exclusive access to a state-granted rent-seeking privilege. They became risk-averse guardians of the status quo, using their influence to block any reform that might threaten their licensed gravy train. The salt monopoly, designed to strengthen the state, was now creating a powerful interest group whose wealth was structurally opposed to change or efficiency. By the late Ming, the system was cracking under its own weight. Smuggling was rampant, estimated to account for nearly half of all salt consumed. The frontier armies were chronically undersupplied because the certificate grain exchange system was broken by corruption. Peasant revolts, fueled by economic hardship, often targeted salt tax offices. When the Manchu invaders from the north swept down in the 17th century, the Ming state was fiscally exhausted. Its most prized revenue engine, the salt monopoly, was a bloated, leaking vessel. It had reached its bureaucratic zenith, but in doing so, had sacrificed the agility and effectiveness that once made it the funder of empires. The stage was set for one final dramatic act. The Qing Dynasty, another conquest regime, initially followed the Ming playbook. They saw the salt monopoly as a pre-existing revenue machine to be taken over and operated. They streamlined some of the worst Ming excesses and, for a time, in the prosperous 18th century, the High Qing, the system functioned well enough. Revenue flowed. The salt merchant families of Canton and Yangzhou continued their opulent lifestyles, and the empire seemed stable. However, the Qing faced a new, internal demographic pressure, a population that had exploded to over 300 million people. The demand for salt was higher than ever, but the state-controlled production methods were stagnant, unable to scale efficiently to meet it. The true existential threat, however, came from the sea. Following the Opium Wars and the forced opening of China via the Treaty of Nanjing, 1842, Western powers and their goods flooded into treaty ports. Among these goods was salt. Not the coarse, sometimes impure Chinese salt, but refined, pristine, and most importantly, cheap salt produced by modern industrial evaporation techniques in places like Liverpool and India. This foreign salt was not subject to the heavy monopoly taxes. Sold in the treaty ports, it undercut the official salt price by a wide margin. The Qing government was trapped. It could not lower its own salt tax without crippling its revenue. Yet it could not stop the inflow of foreign salt without provoking another military confrontation with the European powers. Smugglers now had a potent news source. They could import cheap foreign salt and sell it inland, evading both the monopoly and customs. The black market, always a nuisance, became an unstoppable tide. The sacred price differential, the very heart of the monopoly's profitability, was being destroyed by global market forces. The state's 2,000-year-old control over this basic commodity was being rendered obsolete by technology and free trade imperialism. Desperate, the late Qing attempted half-hearted reforms, proposing to replace the monopoly with a straightforward production tax. But these efforts were sabotaged by the entrenched salt bureaucracy and the powerful merchant interests who stood to lose everything. The system was too fossilized to adapt. By the early 20th century, as the Qing dynasty teetered, the salt monopoly was a hollow shell. It was widely hated, grossly inefficient, and leaking revenue from every seam. It no longer strengthened the state. It symbolized the state's weakness, corruption, and inability to meet the needs of its people in a modern world. When the dynasty finally fell in 1912, the monopoly fell with it, not with a bang, but with a weary sigh of irrelevance. The new Republic of China, founded by Sun Yat-sen, inherited a bankrupt state and an ideological commitment to modernization. The salt monopoly was an obvious target. It was a relic of feudal extraction, a symbol of everything the revolution sought to overthrow. In 1913, the new government, under intense pressure from foreign creditors and domestic reformers, officially abolished the state salt monopoly. It was replaced with a centralized salt administration that collected a uniform production tax, allowing private companies to produce and trade salt freely for the first time in over 2 millennia. The mountains of bureaucratic ledgers were burned or archived. The salt police were disbanded. The immediate economic effect was a boon for consumers. The price of salt dropped dramatically as competition and industrial methods took hold. Accessibility improved. The shadow economy of smuggling largely vanished overnight, as the incentive was removed. For the state, however, the transition was rocky. The predictable, if corrupt, revenue stream of the monopoly was gone, replaced by a tax that was harder to collect and easier to evade in the chaos of the warlord era. The government struggled to replace the lost income, contributing to its chronic fiscal instability. Yet, the ghost of the monopoly never fully departed. The concept of state control over essential strategic resources remained deeply embedded in the Chinese political psyche. While salt was freed, other commodities, tea, porcelain, and later, in the communist era, grain, steel, and energy, would see the state assert direct or indirect control. The logic of Guan Zhong, that the state must command the mountains and seas, key resources, to ensure stability and fund its projects, proved enduring. The methods changed, but the underlying principle of using economic control as a tool of governance survived. In the modern era, we see echoes of the salt monopoly not in literal state sales of salt, but in analogous systems. Government control over land sales, which provides a massive portion of local revenue in China today, functions similarly. A state monopoly on a vital resource, land, generating rent-like income. The management of strategic reserves of oil, rare earth minerals, and grain follows the same ancient logic of securing essentials against scarcity. The salt monopoly's legacy is thus a template. The idea that the most effective tax is often an invisible one, woven into the fabric of daily necessity, and that economic control can be as potent a tool of power as any army. The 2,000-year saga of China's salt monopoly is far more than a curious fiscal history. It is a masterclass in the relationship between power and economics. It demonstrates with stunning clarity how a state can engineer a system to extract wealth from its population without triggering immediate revolt by targeting a good with perfectly inelastic demand. The monopoly was a silent, daily tax on breathing, on living. It proved that control over a basic necessity is the ultimate form of leverage, more reliable than ideological loyalty or military force. The story also reveals the eternal dance between control and evasion, between the architect state and the ingenious individual. For every bureaucratic innovation, the license, the certificate, the zone, there was a corresponding innovation in smuggling, corruption, and black market finance. This struggle drove unintended consequences. It created financial instruments, certificates as currency, spurred infrastructure, roads for patrols became trade routes, and shaped social classes, the salt merchant aristocracy. The monopoly was not a static imposition, but a dynamic ecosystem that evolved in conflict with the society it sought to dominate. Finally, the rise and fall of the monopoly holds a stark lesson about adaptability. The system thrived for centuries because it solved a fundamental problem, funding a centralized state in a pre-industrial economy. It collapsed not because of a moral failing, but because it could not adapt to three seismic shifts: massive population growth, the arrival of industrial production technology, and the imposition of a globalized free trade order. It was a perfect machine for a closed world, shattered by an open one. Its demise warns that any system of control, no matter how sophisticated, becomes a vulnerability if it cannot evolve. So, the next time you reach for that humble shaker, consider the weight of history in its grains. That white crystal once dictated the fate of empires, financed wars of unification, built the Great Wall, and inspired rebellions. It created bureaucrats and outlaws, princes and paupers. It was a currency, a bond, a weapon, and a lifeline. The story of salt in China is the story of civilization itself, a relentless pursuit to master our environment, to organize ourselves, and to secure the foundations upon which everything else is built. It is a testament to a simple, profound truth. He who controls the necessities controls the world. From the kitchens of peasants to the ledgers of emperors, salt carved the economic bedrock of a civilization. It's a story of invisible control, ingenious rebellion, and the relentless search for power in the most mundane places. The monopoly is gone, but its logic endures wherever states seek to turn necessity into revenue. If you found this deep dive into the hidden mechanics of power fascinating, make sure to subscribe to Blood Money Files. Hit the notification bell so you don't miss our next investigation, where we'll uncover how another everyday object was weaponized for economic warfare. What common item from your kitchen do you think could be used to control a modern economy? Let us know in the comments below.